We're hosting today a very timely debate on bridging the global North-South divide. It's a thematic issue that has been of focus to us over the past few years, particularly within the context of global governance reform. And we're delighted to present that angle at this year's summit with our esteemed guests. We're gonna look broadly, but also specifically at where we currently stand with global governance reform, ranging from climate change to finance mechanisms, to alternative forms of multilateralism like BRICS and beyond. And what I wanted to do today is to kick off our panel and debate with an opening question for our panelists. We know the system is broken, but we are multilateralists at heart. So where do we go from here? And why have traditional multilateral organizations failed to not just address global challenges effectively, but portray and implement the interests of the global South and specific? We'll start with our first speaker, Professor Maja, over to you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here with all of you for this really important dialogue. So, the system is indeed broken in many respects, but we also have to look at the glass being half full, I would say, just from the outset, saying, I'm a strong believer, as you noted, in multilateral system. So when looking for the areas of what is broken, at the same time, we have to look at what we have achieved collectively in an international community and what we can progress upon. And there are some very strong foundations there. So my perspective primarily comes from the Climate Governance Commission work over the last couple of years, which is a commission looking at international governance reforms and enhancements from a truly international perspective. So the commission is co-chaired by Mary Robinson of the Elders, founded by Nelson Mandela, as well as Johan Rockström, our scientific co-chair, and Maria Fernandez Espinosa, a very prominent government official previously from Ecuador. She went on to be the president of the General Assembly, amongst other roles. And we have these extraordinary commissioners from around the world. For example, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first female head of state of an African nation, the AAU youth envoy, as well as indigenous Mexican youth commissioner. And we're working with policy think tanks, for example, in India, Brazil, really including the whole world in this interrogation. How do we fix climate governance? And we've had a lot of really deep conversations, in fact, and really on bridging this North-South divide. And this is why I was really excited to be invited for this panel, because we've had very, very extended and deep discussions, which have been incredibly productive, actually, on the Commission, to get to the bottom of various issues that in particular have been very much plaguing scholars, diplomats, experts from the global South in terms, and their concerns are, to sort of summarize on a thumbnail sketch, is inclusion and voice, being included, having a voice on par with everyone else, of course. Financing and money. I mean, this really comes to a head with SDGs and climate finance, for example. And also a sense often in the global North that there isn't an understanding of the histories, the diverse histories of different societies, peoples, regions around the world. So there's a lot of scope for further relationship building and trust building. And we've seen in the work of the Climate Governance Commission, sometimes there's very, very good progress being blocked, sort of with a knee-jerk reaction of a mistrust of global North, or this idea is a global North idea, therefore it will just be used in an extractivist way, and we don't trust the process or the actors. So that has happened in various respects. But then, for example, when speaking to those experts further, they said, oh, actually, that's quite a good idea, but we need to make sure, we can trust it. There will be ongoing checks and balances and transparency. So a lot of what needs to happen in terms of fixing our multilateral system is really addressing these various issues, giving voice, having those deeper conversations, and building trust at a deeper level, so there actually can be genuine international cooperation.
Thank you, Professor Maja.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And I am Marta from the BRICS Policy Center in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. And to answer the question, you have been discussing a lot in the BRICS Policy Center about this global governance, this global order, that reflect the world of the post-Second World War of 1945 and reflect in some way a very elitist design of the world, because it's the design of the ones that were the victors of the Second World War. So what we call the liberal order is in fact a very elitist order. Because if, for example, we look to the United Nations, and of course, I think that today we have to reinforce the United Nations because it is the best we have, where in the General Assembly, every state has one vote, but at the same time, you have to reform and democratize the global governance. Why democracy is only valid to the domestic terrain? When you speak about democratization of the UN, of the Bretton Woods institutions, everybody looks with suspicions. Now, so I think that to the Global South countries to have more space, voice, vote in this organization, it's essential to reform these organizations. You cannot have only 5 countries, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, deciding the geopolitical path of the world, or not deciding, because in fact they are not deciding. The Security Council is paralyzed. So it's very important first to try to reinforce these multilateral institutions, because what you are seeing now is a series of unilateral actions, sanctions, tariffs, and that are in some way implemented outside the institutions of the World Trade Organization, for example. We are seeing how power is subverting law, for example, and you are seeing several kinds of menaces to the sovereignty of states. You have been seeing a humanitarian disaster in Gaza, and what you are seeing is that these organizations are paralyzed. So I think that related to the question that is put today, how to connect, how to bridge in the global North-South, the first thing is to recognize that there is, in fact, a material and a symbolic gap. There is inequality. Inequality structures our world. So to be able to fight against something, you have to nominate, you have to give the name. So you have a very unequal world, a very unequal division of labor globally. You have all kinds of inequalities, social, economical, political, of gender, of race. And so you have to fight against this inequality. And in some way, we have to recognize the history of these inequalities, the history of colonialism, of exploitation, that in the end suggests to us that you have, of course, common responsibilities, but at the same time, you have different responsibilities because you have different resources to deal with these inequalities. So it's very important that you continue in some way trying to reform the global governance, the global institutions, to give more voice, space to countries of the global south in the name of this democratization of the global order. And at the same time, it's very important also to look to the world in not a simple way, not the idea that you have another Cold War that divides the world with the West against the East, etc. But to look also to these categories, the global North and the global South, as very confused, because you have the South in the North, go to the streets of San Francisco, for example, and you have also the North in the South. Mm-hmm. So all these categories are categories that have to be, in some way, thinking in a more overlapping way. So I will stop here. Thank you.
I have a lot of follow-up questions, but we'll pass first to Professor Augusto.
I think the question you raise of why the multilateral system has struggled to cope with the challenges is a very vital question. It's very much at the center of what we're trying to understand in this session. And let me give you a few examples. I think part of the problem is one of what I would call jurisdiction or mandate, right? Let me give you an example from my own personal experience. The IMF was set up mainly to deal with countries at an individual level, right? The problem is that over time, the nature of crisis has changed dramatically, and many of the crises today are no longer country-level crises, they're systemic. Yeah. The 2008-2009 crisis was a systemic crisis of the global financial system. COVID was a systemic crisis. And the IMF does not have the resources to deal with a crisis that is systemic. It can lend money to a few member countries and deal with individual country-specific crises, but not systemic crises. So that's one problem, right? And also, the IMF has a problem of asymmetry, the way it deals with its members. It has a lot of leverage with a country that is borrowing its resources, like Argentina, but it has zero leverage with the United States or the big industrial powers, right, who don't borrow, right? That's a problem. It undermines the credibility of the organization. Then a second issue has to do with something that has been commented by Maja and by Marta, which has to do with what I would call the global governance architecture, which has not been updated to the changes that have taken place in the recent decades, right? We have problems today which did not exist back in 1945 when the UN came into being, climate change being one of them, right? It was there already in the background, but there was no recognition of it. Inequality, the nature of warfare, all these things, have evolved in many ways, and the organizations very often have failed to adapt themselves. And then finally, there is what I call an issue of governance, right? Again, let me go back to the IMF because it's an illustration. I think everybody in the audience will agree that by now, the United States and China, in terms of their footprint in the global economy, are broadly equivalent. I won't go into the indicator, but just it's broadly acceptable that depending on the GDP indicator that you look at, either the US is bigger than China or China is bigger than the US, all right? Yet the voting power of the United States in the IMF is 17% plus. The voting power of China in the IMF is less than 6%. Makes no sense. Again, it undermines the credibility of the organization that it hasn't been able to adjust its internal governance to reflect the realities of today. I think all of these things contribute to create a situation where the organization struggle. They struggle to cope because of these factors.
Professor Maja, I wanted to ask maybe a bit of a controversial question on climate governance, because when we think of climate governance today, all eyes go on the COP process. And the COP process seems to be kicking the can down the road every single year, depending on different presidencies, different priorities, different regions. It's sort of the go-to space of, okay, we'll talk about this at the next COP, and then the next COP, and the one after that. How would you see a more, what would be an ideal reformed COP process? Would that be a better solution, or should we do things on the road to COP alternatively, not to replace COP as a process, but how do we tackle this beyond the theatrics of an annual conference?
Yeah, this is a great question and hugely relevant for everybody on the planet, actually, at the moment, because this is indeed the central international governance venue for managing the climate. And we actually, just before COP29, released a letter on climate COP reform, co-sponsored it with the Club of Rome and Al Gore's Climate Reality Project. This letter, to our surprise, got thousands of hits in the media. I think it was because really key people who had been behind the Paris Agreement negotiation and in governance at that time, for example, Ban Ki-moon and Christiana Figueres and others signed this letter to say exactly what you're saying, that it does seem like theatrics and simply sort of a delaying and stalling sort of venue even though I would say that still a lot gets done at the COPs. The climate COPs, you know, very slow, painstaking sort of multilateral steps forward, which of course are very ill-suited by the urgency of the climate challenges we confront and the rapid speed of transformations in our economies and societies that we actually need to address the challenge. This proposal for climate COP reform, making them more effective, efficient, focused, having working meetings, as you suggest, throughout the years, but within the framework of the CCC and the Paris Agreement, make them more agile, implementation focused. We proposed in our report to have an accountability mechanism to strengthen that, to have truly independent assessment of the ambition of the and fairness of the various NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So we're working on that the best we can. We'll be in touch with the COP30 presidency in Brazil amongst UNFCCC. But just to get back to your question also, can we put everything on COPs? And our view on the Commission is no. We have to try to be thinking of solutions across the international system, turning the screws, tightening the current mechanisms, regimes that we have, for example, trade and climate. We can do so much through trade too. So we're working, for example, with various trade experts, Dan Esty at Yale, who's done this Villers sustainability trade set of proposals. Also, you know, the Secretary General has suggested an emergency platform for general global shocks. We've proposed this for planetary emergency. This is no new institutions. It's just defragmenting the international system, bringing the institutions together to focus on urgent climate action. So we're working on a multi-pronged kind of approach because we think it's absolutely imperative and you know, trying to push things forward at the COPs to the extent that we can.
Marta, I want to kind of zoom in on BRICS a bit because I'm personally very excited about the expansion of BRICS. I think alternative forms of multilateralism are important on the road to actual wider scale reform. But BRICS has not had the, I would say, fair reputation that it had in some regions who are not as excited. So how accurate do you find the characterization of BRICS as an anti-West bloc? Is there any truth to it? And how does Brazil see its role there?
Yeah. Let's see. Since I became like the director of the center, of the BRICS Policy Center, every week I receive several calls from the United States Embassy, because they want to know better what is BRICS, what's the agenda of BRICS. BRICS is, in fact, a counter-hegemonic or anti-Western bloc or not. What I can say is that BRICS, first to say that when BRICS is created, several analysts start to say BRICS will not last because the countries that are part of the BRICS are so different in terms of social relations, economic dimensions, of culture, etc. And now what we are seeing is that more than 30 countries are trying to enter the BRICS. What explains this attraction of the bloc? What I always say is that countries are trying to, in some way, search for diversification of their commercial relation, but also there is a social or a kind of symbolic terrain to explain this entry. And this has to do with the defense of a multipolar world. What this means? That in some way, they are trying to say to us that it's very important to respect the difference between states. In the Western world, in the world, you are trained and socialized with the idea that the difference is a problem. And as a problem, you have to eliminate or to convert difference. But what BRICS countries are trying to show is that difference can be a richness, can be a strength. And so they are demanding, in some way, the right of the states to have their own languages, their own currencies, their own way of modernizing, their own history, social organization, culture, instead of the single story. You know, by Chimamanda Adichie, the dangers of a single history. And you know that this single history is a West Side history. So when these countries are trying to construct a multipolar world that's not more unipolar, or this is viewed as an anti-Western approach. Now, so the idea, for example, of de-dollarization, that is today one of the main agendas of BRICS, it does not mean that there will be a currency that will replace dollar. This is not the idea. The idea is to have more currency to do commercial trades in several currencies. So to, in some way, defend the sovereignty of the states. And there are several countries, then I can say more about this, as Brazil, that And I think also other countries as India, etc., that adopt a very non-alignment idea. Because these countries are very pressed to say, you are with the West or with the East. You are your friend or enemy. And Brazil did not buy this idea of the Cold War, or you have to be with him or with the other, and say, I can be friend of several countries. And this is a very pragmatic also approach. I can have commercial relations with Russia, with China, with the United States, and the power ones don't have to say to me with whom I have to relate in the world. So I don't think that BRICS is an anti-Western grouping, but it is a grouping that is trying to, in some way, give to the world spaces for other countries. And in this way, of course, to construct a multipolar world, you have, in some way, to, in some way, the privileges of the West have to be reduced. Yes.
Professor Augusto, you've spoken at length on how some challenges transcend the global North-South divide. So there are things where, yes, we can kind of categorize it into very neat, like global South priorities versus global North priorities. But issues like gender equality, for example, they transcend those divides. How can we use multilateralism to bridge those gaps in particular?
Thank you for that very good question. If I could just add a little footnote to Marta. I think that the interest in the BRICS will rise in coming years, among other things, because we see the G7, right, which is another country grouping, about to enter possibly an intra-trade war among its members, right? Which is I did not think that I would be saying this, a month ago or 2 months ago, but this is about to happen, right? So I think that countries will say, hey, maybe the BRICS is not so bad after all, right? Okay, but the question that you raise is actually a vital one, because it seems to me that part of the problem of these tensions, high-income countries, low-income countries, global North, global South, is basically the lack of recognition that, in fact, when you actually look at the global problems that we face, they straddle national borders. They don't make distinctions between South and North, right? We're not going to be able to address climate change successfully unless we recognize that there is a global systemic problem that requires cooperation across national borders between global North and global South, right? And this is just one example, right? If you ask me, what does the data suggest about, for instance, discrimination against women? Is that mainly a global South problem? Is this something that you mainly discover in sub-Saharan African countries or the Middle East and so on? No, absolutely not. If you look at the data that is put out with the World Bank, and there is the most powerful database on gender discrimination is located at the World Bank. It was my great honor that one of my teams actually significantly expanded that database in the last 10 years. It now covers 192 countries. Out of that database, you discover that gender discrimination is pervasive. It's everywhere. Global North, Global South, it makes no distinction. Of the 190 countries, only 10 countries don't have any overt form of discrimination against women in their laws. 95% of the countries, in fact, have a gender problem, right? So that's just two examples. I could give you more. Inequality. Is inequality a problem in South Africa and Colombia, which are the two countries with some of the worst Gini coefficients? Not at all. Inequality is pervasive in the global North as well, right? So how are we going to address this issue? Again, it's an issue that will require international cooperation and so on. And those are just a few examples. I mean, how are we going to finance the transition to a green economy? Yeah. You know, some of the comments made by Ms. Groff, very interesting, very relevant to that question. This is, again, something that will require concerted action involving the global north and the global south countries, right? So for that reason, I am a little bit skeptical, at least in my own comments, when I speak somewhere, to emphasize, these distinctions between global north and global south, right? I think that if you do a little too much of that, you run the risk that, in fact, we're going to lose sight of the fact that, we are confronting common challenges which absolutely require all of us working together. And for that reason, it seems to me, it goes back to your first question, we need to strengthen the multilateral system. We need to reform what you call the traditional organizations of multilateralism. We need to reform and modernize the UN system and so on. Without that, then I think it's a very, very dark future for all of us.
And I have a question to all panelists, actually, because it feels like there's an elephant in the room when it comes to this debate, and it's actual veto power at the UN Security Council. So is UN Security Council reform a buzzword that we're going to keep seeing heads of state use and every UNGA? Or do you actually see hope in that kind of... I don't think we're going to have a multilateral system that completely gets rid of the veto system. But that's why I was excited about initiatives like BRICS, is because we are kind of building an alternative multilateral order instead of saying, the UN doesn't work, etc. But at the end of the day, the Security Council veto power is the biggest roadblock for multilateral reform, whether it's through climate, gender, the wars we see in our region. How do you see us moving forward on that?
Yeah, and as Marta was saying also, and Augusto, about the Bretton Woods institutions, of course, imbalances. So absolutely, the veto power at the UN Security Council is a fundamental blocker to system evolution and transformation, particularly key UN institutions, although it's not the only blocker. It's one. But just to note that the issue of the veto of the P5 countries has been the most raised issue within the UN system as a topic for reform. So countries, the majority of members of the United Nations also have a problem. And again, this is an issue that isn't just a global north, global south. It's about basic governance legitimacy and fairness. Yeah. So in the book that Augusto and I wrote with another colleague in 2020, we proposed, we thought, a rational, legitimate way to reorganize the Security Council into an executive council, and we suggested, indeed, the veto. It's another anachronism, as Marta was saying, from a different time. We're not in the post-World War era where victors are sort of kind of dividing up power or consolidating. We're in a very different era where we have a rules-based system which is enshrined in the Charter. We have international law that is supposed to progress and develop. So I think, yes, we have to address the veto power, and I'm more optimistic that we will get there. And there have been erosions of that power. For example, after the invasion of Ukraine, there's an initiative by the General Assembly for the Security Council to report to it when there is a veto vote passed, and to justify. There's calls by major nations, including a P5 member, to abstain from using the veto in the face of atrocity crimes. So there's already an erosion, but I think it goes to deeper international cultural norms, and another layer of our shared culture of talking about international relations as it's always a power game. there has to be a superpower or multipolar or unipolar. Why can't we have a genuinely diverse, multilateral system, international community based on shared values, norms, fairness, respect, not domination, not certain privileges, as Marta was noting very aptly. We have to change our international culture, also what we expect from states.
Yeah.
We think there should be, for example, a threat of violence or military power. It's like, if you actually read the Charter, this is what it was meant to transform, to move towards a different rule-based international order based on peace, being good neighbors, which is actually in the Charter,
Very
etc.
relevant today, actually, yes, for sure.
Thank you for the question. First, I think I will contextualize about Brazil, because Brazil, since the beginning of the United Nations, of the creations, has this dream to be part of the Security Council as a permanent member. So it's something that is like a historical demand of Brazil. Now, 2 years ago, in the summit of BRICS in South Africa, there is this enlargement of BRICS. Several countries entered to the BRICS. And there is a kind of discussion internally in the government of Brazil, because part of the diplomacy of Brazil does not want this enlargement. And to justify it, they say, because all the decisions in BRICS are in some way get by consensus. If more countries enter the BRICS, so if there are like 10, 15 countries, it will be very hard to get the consensus. And maybe you could have some technical and coordinator problems. But this is the same discourse that goes against Brazil when Brazil tried to enter in the Security Council as a permanent member. People say, but if with 5 members, permanent member, it's so difficult to have a consensus. Do you imagine if it have 10, 15 members? And so how Brazil will repeat the same discourse that in some way goes against Brazil, goes against the aspirations of Brazil to enter the Security Council. So I think when you are debating the reform of the Security Council, there are like two views. One is the world changed. The world is not anymore the world of 1945. So we have to adapt the Security Council to the new realities, including, for example, Japan and Germany that have lost the Second World War, etc. But there are other countries that are trying to say, no, you have to go further, not only update, but also give space to continents, to regions that are not in the Security Council as permanent members, as, for example, Latin America countries, as, for example, African countries, etc. So there is this kind of debate. And what I always say is that today people are talking a lot about the paralysis of the Security Council, of course, because related to the Ukrainian war, Russia is a permanent member, and related to the Middle East war, the United States is a permanent member, and so it will go against any cessfire in the Middle East. But if you look to the history of the Security Council, it's a history of paralysis. Because during the Cold War, there is like this veto between the United States and the Soviet Union. So it's not a history of success. It's a history of failure. But at the same time, these countries that have this privilege will not abandon this privilege. And in this scenario that is very polarized, it's very difficult to define who will enter. Because if Japan and Germany enter as permanent member, it will, in some way, give more power to one side of this polarization, to the Western side. So it's very difficult. There are some ideas to create a third categories of members that are not, that doesn't have the veto power, but are like permanent members. But of course, this is very difficult to achieve.
Oh, this is a fascinating subject. If I can just add a few little sort of footnotes to some of the very good comments made before me. I think that I totally agree with Marta. The Security Council is a completely dysfunctional body, all right? And it paralyzes the UN system because, of course, the original charter puts a great deal of authority and power in the Security Council, right? The Security Council has two problems. One is the veto, and the other one is an issue of representation, right? I'm going to share with you an anecdote. I was in Geneva in late November, and I had a meeting with the Indian ambassador in Geneva. And he was saying, you know, commenting on the utter ridiculousness of the fact that here we have a country, India, that is the most populous country in the world, 1.4 billion people. Within a few years, India will be the third largest economy in the world, right? And yet, it gets to serve on the Security Council once every, very, very seldom, right? Because it enters through the 10 two-year rotations of the non-permanent members, right? And he was saying, this makes no sense. It lacks complete credibility. It is a situation that simply undermines the credibility of the whole UN system, right? Do you know, this is a little known fact, there are 62 countries among the 193 members of the UN that have never served on the Security Council. Not once, not ever, right? Now, how about that for voice? How about that for representation? If you're a citizen of one of these countries, your country's opinion is attached, has been given a value of 0 in the entire history of UN. It's not right, right? So, Marta, respectfully, I'm not sure that the solution to the veto is to give the veto to more countries, right? Because if it is dysfunctional with 5 countries, it'll be completely, totally dysfunctional forever with 8 vetoes or 9 vetoes, right? And it's not just Brazil who wants it. Japan wants it, Germany wants it, India wants it.
So let's abolish it.
Yes.
Call it a day.
So let me, in 30 seconds, propose a solution to the issue of the veto and the representation, right? And this is arguably not very original, all right? When the Bretton Woods organizations were set up in 1944, right, they were discussing their governance structure. You know, how is decision-making going to take place? And they did not opt for the veto, right? Even though at that time the United States was overwhelmingly, and the UK were overwhelmingly the biggest contributors, right? No, they said, we're going to operate in a system of weighted voting in which every country will have a voice, right? So I would say something that would be a great improvement over the present system is let all 190 member countries of the UN be members of the Security Council. And then you say, oh, does that mean we have 193 chairs? And I say, no, not at all. You don't need 193 chairs. Have 24 chairs. And then you organize countries by clusters, right? So let China have a chair. Let the US have a chair. But then let countries in my part of the world the southern cone of Latin America, we group together and we come together, 6 of them. This is the way the governance structures of the IMF and the World Bank have been organized. There is no veto in those organizations, formally. And they have worked relatively well, right? So this is, it seems to me, there are many other proposals, of course, but this is one sensible way. You give voice to everybody and you do away with the veto, essentially by reorganizing the structure by making every member a country. Every country a member.
We'll promote your solution and see where that takes us. Before opening questions to audience members, I have also panel-wide question on the significance of definitions. Do we benefit from the rhetoric of a global north versus a global south divide, or does that perpetuate stereotypes that are actually not helpful to bridge that gap? Because within the context of climate debates, for example, global north, global south, the discussion goes around who's going to finance who. It perpetuates a different but equally dangerous power dynamic of dependencies. And would we benefit from moving away from a global north, global south framework? Because I also see equally problematic in Western rhetoric. A very common sentiment or framing is the West versus the rest, and the rest is actually the majority of the international community. So would we actually, is it to the benefit of the global south not to frame their struggles within a global south umbrella, or is there merit in the sort of let's band together under that definition?
Yeah.
Happy to.
I can start.
Sure.
Yeah. I think that when you talk about the global south, you don't talk in a descriptive way. You're not describing the world as it is. When you talk about the global south, you are talking about a political project. And in some way, it's important to thinking through this concept to try to fight for justice or redistributive justice. When you are talking about, for example, climate change and the necessity to finance climate changes, it's important, this category, this political category. Of course, countries are very different in the global south. There are asymmetries inside the global south. Yeah. But it's important in some way, strategically, to use the term, even recognize that there is no essence. It's not a description of the world. There are the south in the north, there are the north in the south. But, of course, as a political project, it's important to demand the transfer of technology, to demand, for example, alleviate of the debt of the African countries, and several demands that deals with these reparations for histories of colonialism, etc., that is very important to use or mobilize the term in some way to fight against inequalities in the world.
I have a lot of sympathy for your sort of question about the utility of this divide. And as I said before, I don't want to repeat myself, as long as we recognize that most of the challenges that we face are global challenges, I think that can help us to protect ourselves from doing a little too much of this, us against them, right? Yeah. However, having said that, there is one area where I think the global south has a definite claim, and that is the question of what I call voice or representation. It is not acceptable that the global south countries don't have appropriate representation in the governing structures of places like the IMF and the World Bank, all right? That is actually very much a global south problem. it's interesting, it's not a US problem. It's not that the US quota in the IMF and the World Bank is too high. It's actually Europe. It's the European Union. The European Union has a quota of 30%, which is completely out of line with its actual relative weight in the global economy, right? And European Union countries are all in the global north, right? So that's an issue in which I would say the global south needs to make the point repeatedly, over and over again, in every fora, at the BRICS, at the UN General Assembly, in all other places. It is not acceptable that they should not have their appropriate place in this governance structure of the multilateral organizations. But that is as far as I would go. That is as far as I go. Second point, this is a painful point to make, but I think it's a point that is worth making. I think we citizens of the global south countries, and I say we because I'm Latin American, and you're Latin American, we need to be a little bit more self-critical, right? Let me give you an example of this, right? Many of the countries in the global south are asking for debt relief. Yeah, debt is a serious problem. And it's true enough. I mean, there are countries which are on unsustainable debt paths. And the fact that they have to fulfill these debt obligations means there is no money for poverty, there is no money for COVID vaccines, there is malnutrition, and so on and so forth. So there's a serious problem. Having said that, we are not blameless, right? A lot of the problems that we have on the fiscal side can be traced back to corruption, it can be traced to ineffective governance, it can be traced back to things that we ourselves have done to ourselves, right? Argentina, an incredibly rich country in terms of natural resources, extremely poorly managed in the last 50 years, right? It doesn't pay its debts, it has gone on default repeatedly, right? Is that a global north problem? No, I'm sorry, it's not. It is very much a domestic problem that has to do with bad policies, it has to do with corruption, it has to do with mismanagement, right? So I think that to enhance the quality of this conversation between global north and global south, I think it helps not to do finger pointing, not to say, oh, it's all your fault, it's colonialism, it's American imperialism, and so on and so forth. Many of these problems are of our own making.
Indeed, it can be helpful in some contexts or populations to raise awareness, but indeed how to disaggregate and complexify the overlapping realities. And for example, as Marta mentioned, elites in the global south that are actually quote unquote global north and vice versa. What are really the economic issues, the social development issues, exclusion issues that we can actually bring into really sharp focus and focus our energies on, and also indeed being self-critical of the various power dynamics, international, colonial, neo-colonial, but also those national dynamics of corruption, et cetera, which are absolutely imperative to address. And then generally, I think we need new language and new narratives at the international level. I don't think we've discovered really the language yet. Solidarity, how do we build true solidarity around shared goals, really recognize our interdependence on these absolutely critical global issues. And sometimes I have seen, global South narratives deployed in an unhelpful way. For example, saying climate change is a global north crisis. It's not a global south crisis. And it's like, unfortunately, it's a planetary, like it's going to affect the most vulnerable, in the countries with the least. Unfortunately, that's just where we're at. Yeah. So we have to solve the financing problems, but we have to, for example, understand the reality of the science and how we respond together. So. Yeah, what I'd love to see is, these new narratives. How do we powerfully talk about interdependence, about also economic abundance, and, everyone gets in a panic about where money will come from, but actually we're such a wealthy international community, and I just see a lack of creativity in raising, for example, public international finance, whereas there's so many options to do this.
Before we thank our panelists, I also wanted to give a kind of closing comment or remark, which we haven't discussed yet today, but I think is sort of a follow-up to our discussion, would be the role of regionalism. How do we strengthen regional multilateral organizations, like the Arab League, like the Gulf Cooperation Council, like the African Union. You know, I think that needs to be activated or reformed in parallel on the way to actual UN reform, because there's so much we could do region to region, even as cooperation, by not ignoring the UN, but bypassing the bureaucracy of the UN, region to region, on a lot of these thematic issues. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you.